What if the reason you can't build good habits isn't laziness, lack of discipline, or weak motivation? What if the real problem is that you were never taught how habits actually work? Most people try to change their lives using willpower alone. They promise themselves they'll start waking up earlier, exercise every day, stop procrastinating, eat healthier, but after a few days the motivation disappears, and they fall back into the same routines. But here's the truth. Your brain isn't designed to rely on motivation. It's designed to rely on habits. And once you understand the system your brain uses to create habits, you can make behaviors stick almost automatically. In this video, we're going to break down how habits are formed inside the brain, the powerful habit loop that controls your behavior, and the biggest mistakes people make when trying to change their habits. If you understand these three things, you can completely transform how you build routines that actually last. Let's start with the first question. Every single day you perform hundreds of actions without thinking about them. You wake up and check your phone. You brush your teeth. You make coffee. You open the same apps. You follow the same routines. And most of these behaviors happen automatically. That's because your brain is constantly looking for ways to save energy. Thinking is expensive for the brain. It consumes a lot of mental resources. So whenever possible, your brain tries to turn repeated actions into automatic behaviors. These automatic behaviors are what we call habits. At the neurological level, habits are formed through a process called chunking. When you repeat a behavior enough times, your brain groups the individual steps into one single routine. Instead of thinking through each action, the brain runs the entire sequence automatically. This process happens largely in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, which plays a key role in pattern recognition and behavior automation. When you first start a new activity, your brain is extremely active. Think about learning how to drive. At the beginning, you have to think about everything: steering, looking at mirrors, pressing the pedals, watching traffic. But after enough repetition, driving becomes almost automatic. You can drive for minutes without consciously thinking about every action. That's habit formation in action. But repetition alone isn't enough. Habits form because the brain links behavior with reward. Whenever you perform an action that leads to something positive, pleasure, relief, satisfaction, your brain releases a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is part of the brain's motivation system. It tells the brain, this behavior is important. Remember it, so every time the behavior leads to a reward, the neural pathway becomes stronger. Eventually, the behavior becomes the brain's default response to certain situations. But here's the important part. Your brain doesn't care whether the habit is good or bad. It simply learns what behaviors lead to rewards. That's why the same system that builds healthy routines can also create habits like procrastination, scrolling social media, or eating junk food. To understand how this process works in daily life, we need to talk about one of the most important ideas in behavioral psychology: the habit loop. One of the most influential explanations of habit formation comes from Charles Duhigg in his book, The Power of Habit. He explains that every habit follows a simple cycle called the habit loop. This loop has three components: cue, routine, reward. Understanding this loop is the key to understanding almost every habit in your life. Let's break it down. First, we have the cue. The cue is the trigger that tells your brain to start a behavior. Cues can be many things: a time of day, a location, a feeling, a person, or another action. For example, you sit down at your desk. That's the cue. Next comes the routine. The routine is the behavior itself. Maybe you open your email, maybe you check social media, maybe you grab a snack. Finally, the behavior leads to the reward. The reward is what reinforces the habit. It might be a feeling of pleasure, a sense of relief from boredom, or the excitement of seeing something new online. Here's where it gets interesting. Over time, your brain starts anticipating the reward as soon as the cue appears, and that anticipation creates craving. Craving is what actually drives habits. You don't open Instagram just because your phone exists. You open it because your brain expects the reward of novelty, social interaction, or entertainment. Once the brain learns that cue, routine, reward pattern, it starts running automatically. That's why habits can feel so difficult to break. But there's also good news. Researchers discovered that it's extremely difficult to eliminate habits completely. However, it's much easier to change the routine while keeping the same cue and reward. For example, cue, feeling stressed; old routine, eating junk food; reward, emotional relief; new routine, going for a short walk. The cue stays the same, The reward stays the same, but the behavior changes. This strategy allows you to reshape habits instead of trying to destroy them. However, even when people understand the habit loop, they still struggle to build lasting habits. And that's usually because they make a few very common mistakes. Most people approach habit change in ways that work against how the brain functions. The first major mistake is trying to change everything at once. Someone decides they want to improve their life. So they set huge goals, wake up at 5 a.m. exercise every day, meditate, read for an hour, stop using social media, eat perfectly healthy. This kind of transformation sounds exciting, but the brain sees it as a massive disruption. The more energy a habit requires, the less likely it is to stick. Small habits work better because they require almost no resistance. This is why many behavior experts recommend starting with extremely small actions. Instead of committing to a full workout, start with 5 minutes. Instead of reading a full chapter, read 1 page. Small habits build consistency, and consistency builds identity, which leads to the second big mistake: focusing only on outcomes instead of identity. Many people say, I want to run a marathon. I want to lose weight. I want to learn a language. But successful habit change starts with a different question. Who do you want to become? This idea is strongly emphasized by James Clear in his book Atomic Habits. Instead of focusing on goals, he suggests focusing on identity. For example, instead of saying, I am trying to run, say, I am a runner. Every small action becomes a vote for that identity. When you run, you reinforce the belief that you're a runner. When you write, you reinforce the identity of a writer. Over time, the identity becomes stronger than motivation. The third mistake people make is expecting perfection. Many people think habit formation means never missing a day, but that's not realistic. Life interrupts routines. You get sick, you travel, you have busy weeks. What actually matters is not perfection, but recovery. The most effective habit builders follow a simple rule: never miss twice. Missing once is normal. Missing twice begins the formation of a new habit, the habit of not doing the behavior. So the goal is simple: return to the routine as quickly as possible. Building habits that actually last is not about willpower. It's about understanding how your brain works. Habits form through repetition and reward. They follow the pattern of cue, routine, and reward. And the most successful habit builders focus on small actions, strong identities, and consistency over perfection. When you stop fighting your brain and start working with its natural systems, change becomes much easier. The key isn't massive transformation overnight. It's small actions repeated consistently until they become automatic, because once a habit becomes automatic, it stops requiring discipline, and it simply becomes part of who you are.